Strings of Malice, Snowflake in an Alley, an Old Mother Nonsense story. Chapter 2, Passports. Kuldal 9th Yacht. There was a word for people like the man the street mouse had found herself with. Actually, there were many, and none of them very nice. It made sense. Anyone in his situation was bound to become cold and bitter about it. Then again, people were cold and bitter about a lot of things, and they didn't need to be a dumb sailor to be so. She frowned as she thought about it. Dumb didn't seem right. Even though it is what the keeper at the dockhouse had used, it rang wrong. She'd barely spent a week with this man, and she knew that to be wrong, bone deep. Mind, she didn't believe this solely on the facts that he could read and write in at least 2 languages that she had seen. Not that she herself could read, but she was rather decent with pictures, and half the scribbling in his notebook was vastly different from the words she'd seen around an area all her life. No, not that alone. The first clue had been when he hadn't unsheathed his sword to fight those creeps on the night they met. If there had been a sign or notice that tipped him off, she'd be the last person to know about it. Needless to say, she'd been impressed. Not that she'd ever tell him that. If asked, it was clear that he'd had such an easy time of it because the fools had been so far into the bottom of their mugs before it had even begun. And the others had just been kids. No, she would not praise him for that either. As nice as her dark companion seemed to be, the mistress of the cat house had once told her to never give a man a compliment if he wasn't paying for it. This was the thing that stumped her about her benefactor? John? Suitor? She'd heard the working girls and boys use combinations of those names. The first sort of seemed to fit the situation, and yet didn't. The benefactor was around longer than a few hours and paid for everything, but this one hadn't really asked for anything in return, and that made her suspicious. He wasn't exactly handsome or young, but not nearly as pretty, ugly, or old as the ones she'd seen around town with the night kittens. She had watched him spend a morning cleaning out a shop in exchange for a few pairs of socks that were far too small for him. Odd. She tagged along to watch him muck out a stable in exchange for a shirt too big for him. Not too strange. His was on the ratty side. He had wordlessly bartered a small bag from a fisherman's wife in exchange for helping to fix her husband's boat. That last one had clued her into his plan as she trailed behind him. He already had a bag, though he had handed the new one off to her, along with the socks inside and a few chit that allowed her to gain a pair of shoes from a sailor's shop. He had shaken his head when she'd asked what he wanted in exchange for that. Nothing in this world was free, unless you had quick fingers, and hers had sometimes not been quick enough. There was a reason she only had 4 fingers on her left hand. Good thing she tended to use the other more anyway, always had. Now here was the Pruta question. Why was she staying? Because some hooded nobody had told her to? Sure, she'd never gone to sleep with a full belly so many times in a row before. What was she up to now? 5? She'd never been so warm when she'd woken in the morning. People talked about this thing called summer, but anyone who knew anything knew the sun didn't warm the streets of an area, and she knew the streets of an area well. These were all true, and she still couldn't justify herself or her actions. She was practically following around a man who didn't seem to mind her company, made sure her belly was full, and saw that there was a roof over her head each evening. He'd even handed her the oversized shirt the night before, reworked it into a new, if frumpy, dress for her. She had expected him to want something in return for that at least, but he hadn't. Simply handed it over and patted her head.
Am I a pet now?
She asked aloud across the small table they'd sat at for breakfast. The man just about spat out his water all over the grey tablecloth. It was funny, but answer enough. She may as well have told him she had a tail with the look he was directing at her. She figured she should probably explain. She did quickly, and he appeared to catch on to how she'd come to that conclusion by watching him. Then she sat back in her chair and folded her arms expectantly. He shook his head. His face always pinched in focus, just a little, before he tried to explain something to her in gestures. To be honest, she wasn't entirely sure if the expression was directed at her or himself, but she'd come to understand it as one which told her to watch his hands. He pointed at her.
Me?
She said aloud. He touched his fingers to his lips.
Mouth?
She named the body part. His face let her know that it was the wrong word, but they'd quickly discovered she would, more often than not, get it once she had more to work with. He held up 4 fingers. Now she was confused.
4.
He pointed to himself.
You.
She answered. He nodded, his tell that he was done gesturing and the rest was up to her.
Me, mouth for you.
She muttered to herself as she repeated his gestures. That was a little trick she had discovered usually helped.
You mouth for me.
She changed the sentence only once before it clicked. She was getting good at this.
I speak for you.
She said confidently before her tone turned questioning along with her face.
That's all?
The man nodded and a bashful smile touched the edges of his mouth as he shrugged. She thought about it. He wasn't wrong. That first night, he'd pushed money at her and she'd got them food and a room. As a matter of fact, she'd done it every day they'd been together. As if to prove his point, the waiter walked over with their food and he touched his hand to his chin before gesturing to the young man and looking at her expectantly.
Ta?
She said, automatically translating. That one was practically habit at this point. It was the first gesture she'd learned to read. It only took him 2 shin kicks under the table before she'd figured it out. The young waiter grunted before hurrying away. They had been getting reactions like that most of the morning. The girl had no idea why they'd come to the fancy part of town, though she couldn't say it hadn't been amusing. It was full of the kinds of people who got dressed up, pampered, powdered and perfumed just to go out for directionless walks with only half a mind to perhaps, by accident, meet someone they knew. Clearly, a weather-beaten sailor and a stick-thin street mouse stuck out like eyesores, but it would be little use asking questions. There were some things gestures couldn't quite explain, but the girl was sure she'd find out their purpose soon enough if she just followed him. She dug into her breakfast heartily and hummed happily at the taste. It was good.
It's really enough that all I need to do is order food and beds?
She asked around a mouthful of crispy potato. Her benefactor thought about it a moment before shrugging, then nodded. He waited before shrugging again, tapping his temple and then gesturing to her. What do you think?
I think I've gone and landed me butt in the butter, and I'm not going to try and argue my way out of it.
She responded, as though he'd asked the question aloud.
I'll admit, I'm wondering why we're here. I didn't think you got a kick out of making rich folks squirm, but it would probably draw more attention for you to...
She broke off when he pushed a piece of paper at her. She scanned it incredulously before frowning, her eyebrows quirked up at him indignantly.
You know I can't.
He nodded and held up a placating hand, then gestured for her to eat up. She pocketed the paper and did as she was told. However, the little voice in her head reminded her that good things didn't last forever. She would eat while she could, and enjoy it. A while later, her curiosity was finally sated. They stood in a short line within an ornate building. Everything glittered in metal furnishings that were polished to a mirror's finish, and light green stone columns appeared to glow in the candlelight. Toned down by the grey sun, ebbing sluggishly through the ever-present cloud cover and glass ceiling, it was still the nicest place the girl had ever been. The sound of train bells mixed with idle chit-chat and the chime of a massive, overhanging clock made up quite the atmosphere of busybodies.
Are we going on a trip?
She asked, and he nodded, pointing to the piece of paper he'd given her earlier. She clutched at it tightly as she watched the woman in front of them hand over more coins than the street mouse had seen in all her life. 2 men in matching orange suits seemingly appeared from nowhere to levitate off the obscene number of trunks the woman had with her. The man behind the counter, in the same colors as the other 2, but who had apparently been denied the luxury of a jacket, murmured to the woman softly after his eyes caught sight of the raggedy pair standing behind her. She stiffened a little and turned only just enough to see them out the corner of her eye. She turned up her nose pointedly and confidently walked off. The mouse would have thought her the most beautiful person she'd ever seen if her face hadn't worn such a nasty look. It wasn't the first nor the last time they would receive such judgmental looks, but the mouse only rolled her eyes and stuck up her own chin as the man at the counter beckoned them forward. His face was pinched as his eyes scanned the paper she handed over, and his thin moustache twitched when he reached the bottom of the small page. He raised an eyebrow at her benefactor over her head, and, while she was too slow to see it, she knew some form of exchange had taken place. Her benefactor handed a small book over her shoulder, and that seemed to be enough. The man in orange nodded and slipped the paper under the counter before turning to retrieve a small box with a dark black eye embedded in its center. "Please tuck your hair behind your ears, miss," the man told her firmly, but not unkindly. "Stand up straight. Don't smile and look here for me." He tapped the box just above the eye. She glanced back at her benefactor and he nodded encouragingly. So she did as she was told. There was a bright light and dots of color danced before her eyes unsettlingly. She almost panicked, but a reassuring hand on her shoulder kept her steady until the dots faded. The man behind the counter was busy doing a bunch of things in a little book. A paste applied to a small piece of paper, then flipped over to reveal a near skeletal face, with dark circles under hollow eyes and dirty skin. Was that her? Wide grey eyes, a shocked expression, and pointed ears sticking out comically in front of unkempt brown hair. It must have been. The mouse did have pointy ears. She knew that because the kittens had told her so. The man in orange took out a very fancy pen and slipped it into a golden inkwell that he then pushed towards her. "Please place your finger in the groove, miss," he instructed her. She subconsciously wiped her hand on her dress before she did. It felt wrong to be touching something so fine when her fingers were still slightly greasy from their breakfast and near black from dirt. The man in orange picked up the pen and she yelped when she felt a prick in her finger, but the hand on her shoulder tightened ever so slightly, so she didn't move. "Your name, please, miss," the man asked, and the mouse suddenly realized that she had known her benefactor near a week and still, he didn't know her name. Would he laugh at her? Others had. "Please, miss, your name," the man behind the counter asked again, and she swallowed past her suddenly dry throat to murmur,
Irinka.
The man in orange cocked an eyebrow ever so slightly. "I suppose you couldn't tell me if that's with an E or an I?" She shook her head self-consciously. He shrugged, and she watched him return to task. A fine stream of misted red flowed out of the inkwell into the pen as he wrote in fancy letters. "And your family name, miss?"
Don't know,"
she offered softly, oddly embarrassed. She felt the hand move from her shoulder, and she looked back to see her benefactor gesturing to himself. She turned back to the man and pointed over her shoulder.
Same as him."
The man in orange raised an eyebrow, but ultimately, deciding that he didn't give a rat's behind, continued. The moment he was done, she removed her finger from the ink pocket to inspect it. Not even a drop to be seen, though the thin digit did ache a little. The man flipped the book to an open page beside the one her benefactor had handed over, stamped both, and neatly folded a long green piece of paper inside each of them. He placed them on top of each other and held out his hand. "That would be 18 pruta for the tickets and 3 liter for the passport," he stated. She took up the small pouch her benefactor had given her, and she pulled out the money to hand over. The man exchanged it for the books and actually offered her a small smile, after glancing around to make sure he wasn't seen being kind to the likes of them. 2 second-class tickets to Monkokus. You will board on platform 3, coach 4, at 4:30. Your compartment number is 6A. He waited till she repeated.
"Platform 3, coach 4, compartment 6A, at 4:30.
He nodded. "You and your big brother enjoy your trip, Miss Irinka Reed." She took the little book and quickly remembered a tar when her benefactor gestured it. He turned to go, but she quickly opened his book and pointed to the first name.
"What does this say?"
she asked, quick and quiet. The man in orange frowned and seemed like he may do something stupid, before deciding against it. She knew that look all too well. It was the look of someone who simply was not paid enough to care. "It says Lunrith Reed." Irinka murmured another quick tar before running after Lunrith. Such a strange name. though she thought it suited him. He'd found himself a seat in the center of the large waiting area, near a robed gentleman with a long nose reading a newspaper, and had even saved her a seat. She sat down beside him and gingerly handed back his book.
Nice to meet you, Lunrith,
she offered. He smiled and nodded his head before crossing his middle finger over his pointer, curling down the other two and sticking his thumb out. She looked at the gesture a while before pointing to herself.
Irinka,
she asked. He nodded again. The mouse felt pride well up in her chest, that she got it on the first go, though it was far more than that. She was touched that he'd gone and made a gesture specifically for her name. She ignored the feeling. Getting used to the pleasantness of being special would do her no favors. She sat back in her chair to inspect her book. It was a skinny, tiny thing, wrapped in thin brown leather and emblazoned with the silhouette of a prancing hare in copper. The symbol was easy enough to decipher. Every town's guard had the very same mark engraved on their armor, and it flew high on the flags above the city port too. It was the insignia of the Kingdom of Milan.
Does this mean I'm a citizen?
She asked. He nodded, his attention off somewhere in the crowd she could not bother to discover. She said nothing, just held the book tightly in her lap as she waited for him to tell her it was time to go. It shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. She shouldn't think too hard on it, but she knew she would keep the little book safe no matter what.
So we're brother and sister now?
She asked, breaking the silence between them. Lunrith abandoned his people-watching with a shrug and made a couple of gestures Irinka took to mean that he figured he was too young to be her father.
How old are you anyway?
She wondered aloud. He pulled back and his mouth dropped open, hand clutching at an invisible string of pearls as though the question had utterly offended him.
Okay.
She laughed, tucking the book against her belly as she leaned back in her seat.
But really?
His shoulders gave away his soundless chuckle, and he showed her fingers to indicate 30-ish. She would have pegged him older, but she smiled.
You know you're stuck with me now, right?
He rolled his eyes and shrugged again. He was resigned to his fate. He gestured, pulling a hood over his head, and Irinka cocked hers.
You saw her too?
He looked at her in surprise, and the understanding came between the two of them, that they had both thought the strange woman's words had been aimed at them. The silence that passed between them spoke volumes. Maybe it had been for both of them?